Okay, this is part 2 of the series on explicating poetry. And the topic of this video will be figurative language. So before we get started here, I'm going to read this poem by Elizabeth Bishop, The Man Moth. This is an early poem of hers. I think it's from her first collection, North and South, which was published in 1946. And I'm going to refer back to this poem throughout this video series. So I'd like for you to follow along as I read it, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Man Moth, newspaper misprint for Mammoth. Here above, cracks in the buildings are filled with battered moonlight. The whole shadow of man is only as big as his hat. It lies at his feet like a circle for a doll to stand on, and he makes an inverted pen, the point magnetized to the moon. He does not see the moon. He observes only her vast properties, feeling the queer light on his hands, neither warm nor cold, of a temperature impossible to record in thermometers. But when the man moth pays his rare, although occasional, visits to the surface, the moon looks rather different to him. He emerges from an opening under the edge of one of the sidewalks and nervously begins to scale the faces of the buildings. He thinks the moon is a small hole at the top of the sky, proving the sky quite useless for protection. He trembles, but must investigate as high as he can climb. Up the facades, his shadow dragging like a photographer's cloth behind him, he climbs fearfully, thinking that this time he will manage to push his small head through that round, clean opening and be forced through, as from a tube, in black scrolls on the light. Man standing below him has no such illusions. But what the man moth fears most he must do, although he fails, of course, and falls back, scared but quite unhurt. Then he returns to the pale subways of cement he calls his home. He flits, he flutters, and cannot get aboard the silent trains fast enough to suit him. The doors close swiftly. The man moth always seats himself facing the wrong way, and the train starts at once at its full, terrible speed, without a shift in gears or a gradation of any sort. He cannot tell the rate at which he travels backwards. Each night he must be carried through artificial tunnels and dream recurrent dreams. Just as the ties recur beneath his train, these underlie his rushing brain. He does not dare look out the window for the third rail. The unbroken draught of poison runs there beside him. He regards it as a disease he has inherited the susceptibility to. He has to keep his hands in his pockets, as others must wear mufflers. If you catch him, hold up a flashlight to his eye, its all dark pupil, an entire night itself, whose haired horizon tightens as he stares back and closes up the eye. Then from the lids one tear, his only possession, like the bee's sting, slips. Slyly he palms it, and if you're not paying attention, he'll swallow it. However, if you watch, he'll hand it over, cool as from underground springs and pure enough to drink. Figurative language. Lovely Still Life by Red Dawn as our background here. So the primary purpose of explication is to carefully examine the variety of ways poets use language to construct meaning. There are numerous devices that poets keep at their disposal, but we will focus on some of the most common and easily identifiable ones in this presentation. I'm going to list them out for you here. We're going to talk about imagery, metaphor and simile, personification and the pathetic fallacy, symbolism and allegory, paradox and oxymoron, verbal and situational irony, and finally, allusion. What we're going to do is we're going to go through these one by one and give you some examples. Most of them will be illustrations taken from the poem The Man Moth. Okay, so we're going to start with imagery. Imagery is a term for the language a writer uses to create strong sensory impressions in the mind of the reader. Images are most often visual, but they can also be auditory, sound, olfactory, smells, tactile, touch, gustatory, taste, and even kinetic, the sense of movement, the sense of motion. I'll give you a good example of that one here in a moment. Images are not simply nouns. They're not just things. So look for descriptive adjectives modifying nouns. So the word butterfly, for instance, taken by itself, it's not a strong image because there are no describing words to make it vivid. However, a butterfly green as budding leaves, its wings trimmed with flaky gold too fine for panning, steps cautiously on thin black toes along the petal's curled edge. That's pretty purple, but it creates a vivid mental picture. In good imagery, it stands out. It's going to be memorable. Like most literary devices, imagery can help to establish a particular tone or mood in a poem. Images can be effective at nudging or shaping the reader's thoughts and feelings about the writer's topic. So we'll get the Man Moth out here, and I'm going to take a look at the first stanza, and one of the images that really stands out to me is Bishop's description of the moonbeams, which she says are neither warm nor cold. We'll come back to that. And then from stanza 4, this is the stanza where the Man Moth goes to the subway, gets on a train, and here's the sensation of the train's movement, of its speed, the sensation of a train starting and going really fast through a tunnel. So I can give you a screenshot of a hypothetical essay about this poem, a hypothetical explication, where I talk about imagery. Bishop uses tactile imagery to describe the subtle and eerie moonlight, so imagery of touch sensation. And then I attach a quote here: the queer light on his hands, neither warm nor cold, of a temperature impossible to record in thermometers. She later uses kinetic imagery to describe the sensation of riding a subway train. The reader can imagine its sudden, terrible speed without a shift in gears or a gradation of any sort. So hopefully these examples will help you see how you can talk about these literary devices in your own writing. I will talk now about simile and metaphor. Perhaps you remember learning about these in high school. And basically, a metaphor is an implicit comparison between two things that one normally wouldn't think to compare. This association often hinges on certain traits or qualities shared between them, and therefore metaphors often work in combination with imagery. The best metaphors are unexpected and startling. Metaphors can be explicit when the poet uses connective words. I give you some examples here, like, as, then, seems. These words can be used to signal the comparison. In this relatively commonplace and easily identifiable type of metaphor is called a simile. And the man moth has an abundance of these. And I'm going to pick a couple that stand out to me. The first is this one from the first stanza. The shadow being like a circle for a doll to stand on. And then another one from the very last stanza of the poem, comparing his eye to the night sky. It's all dark pupil and entire night itself, whose haired horizon tightens. I think that's great. That's my favorite one in the whole poem, actually. So what might this look like in a written explication? Using a simile, Bishop describes a man's shadow at his feet like a circle for a doll to stand on. Later, she uses a lovely series of metaphors to compare the man moth's eye to the dark sky overhead, describing the haired horizon of his dark pupil and entire night itself. So we'll talk next about personification and something called the pathetic fallacy. They're two very closely related. A special variety of metaphor, personification either endows non-human entities or objects with physical traits of human beings or causes them to perform uniquely human behaviors. Similar to personification, the pathetic fallacy occurs when non-human entities or objects think or feel as a person would. So personification is physical traits and actions, and pathetic fallacy is thoughts and feelings, human-like thoughts and feelings. And the man moth does not have any compelling examples of either personification or pathetic fallacy. So I went to Shakespeare. Shakespeare's always good for this. I went to A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is a short speech from the Queen of the Fairies, Titania, at the end of Scene 1 in Act 3. And this is what she says. "The moon, methinks, looks with a watery eye, and when she weeps every little flower, lamenting some enforced chastity." And what stands out to me here is that the moon is both personified because it's given, she gives the moon an eye, and then the moon weeps. So the idea of a moon that has a face, a human-like face, and that it has these feelings, gives us, I think, a sufficient example of personification and pathetic fallacy. And these are very, very commonplace, just oddly enough, not in the man moth. So symbolism and allegory are next. Symbols are nouns, typically objects. They can be people or living things or places, but they embody abstract ideas. So symbols are nouns that embody abstract ideas. They can represent concepts, values, beliefs, or social groups, among other things. So, for example, a rose is a conventional symbol for love. In a poem, that would be really cliche. A skull and crossbones symbolizes danger or piracy. I think you get the idea here. Unlike metaphors, which involve some degree of parity and resemblance between two things, symbols tend to be more conceptual and may bear no physical resemblance to what they stand for. When a symbol becomes the axis of a poem's purpose and meaning, if the poem really can't do without it, we call it an allegory. Allegories often appear in the form of narrative poems, poems that are intended to codify religious beliefs, philosophies, and cultural values. But more personal symbolism can make lyric poems allegories as well, and I think the man moth qualifies for that. So I will point to this stanza describing the man moth climbing up the buildings to try to get to the moon. Here's my example. In the first three stanzas, the moon develops into a symbol of escape from the griminess of city life, a beacon of hope. If only the man moth could reach it, and here are the lines I highlighted, and push his small head through that round, clean opening. Unfortunately, he never succeeds. So the moon is the symbol of something that is unattainable. Like so many other faceless figures standing below him, the man moth has no distinctive traits, no unique qualities. He is himself a symbol of the city that imprisons him. In this way, the man moth, the poem Man Moth, is an allegory of the squalor and despair of human life. Next, we're going to talk about paradox and oxymoron. And these are very similar figures of speech that involve a pairing of contradictory or incongruous elements. A paradox is a phrase that may seem absurd on first reading, but which closer examination reveals to contain an element of truth. Oxymoron, on the other hand, pairs contradictory words to achieve a similar effect. The two are closely related and not always easy to tell apart, but I would say that paradoxes tend to be more elaborate and structurally integral to the poem, whereas oxymorons are usually pithier, punchier, and briefer in their effect on the reader. So does the man moth contain these? So again, I go to the first stanza and I'm looking at the last lines about the moonbeams on the man's hands. I find this statement to be incredibly paradoxical. And it also contains this phrase, battered moonlight, which I think is a good example of an oxymoron. And I will explain what I mean in the example that I've written for you here. Bishop's descriptions of moonlight in the opening stanza are rich in contradictory image making. The phrase battered moonlight, for example, is an oxymoron. One might think of a pair of sneakers, cell phones, and notebooks as things that are easily battered. But how is it possible to batter light? And yet, in the context of the poem's urban environment, with the sharp edges of buildings and an abundance of hard, reflective surfaces, the idea of battered moonlight makes sense. In her description of the sensation of moonlight on the man moth's skin, Bishop gives an excellent example of paradox. The queer light on his hands, neither warm nor cold, of a temperature impossible to record in thermometers. We know from observation that sunlight reflected from the moon has no perceptible effect on air temperature or the surfaces of terrestrial objects. So Bishop's suggestion that moonlight does have a temperature, that it can be felt and yet not measured, may seem patently absurd. And yet the lines succeed at capturing something, capturing the beauty, mystery, and allure of moonlight. This brings us to irony. And there are different kinds of irony, but the two most common, the most important for beginners, verbal and situational irony. Verbal irony is a word or statement that conveys a secondary meaning that is the opposite of the primary meaning. This double meaning may be either intentional or accidental, unintentional. Some examples of verbal irony that you will recognize would be hyperbole or overstatement. For example, oh geez, I'm blanking on examples all of a sudden. I'm coming up with one for meiosis, understatement. For example, if if something really bad happens to you, something really awful, like I don't know, you get mauled by a bear on the way to work, and your response to it is, "That was wonderful." Obviously, that's not what you really mean. It's obviously also an understatement. These are familiar examples of verbal irony. Another type of irony is situational irony, which occurs when individual actions do not align with results, or when intentions do not align with outcomes, or when beliefs about oneself or about the world do not align with reality. This kind of misalignment can be humorous, but also disappointing and sometimes painful. And the man moth does give us some examples. We'll look at the fourth stanza, and specifically the line, "The pale subways of cement he calls his home." That word "home" there, and the emphasis that Bishop puts on it. He calls the subways of cement his home. That has an element of verbal irony in it. And then from the third stanza, describing him climbing the buildings, he climbs fearfully, thinking that this time he will manage to push his small head through that round, clean opening, which is the moon. Obviously ironic. He's never going to be able to push his head through it because it's not an opening. It's not even something that he can reach by climbing a building, and that is an example of situational irony, I would argue. So let me show you what this might look like in an explication. After the man moth's defeat, he retreats below ground to the pale subways of cement he calls home. The word home in this urban context is clearly ironic. Bishop is aware that what he calls home will controvert her reader's understanding, since for most people, the word home conveys ideas of family, comfort, and security. Certainly not pale subways of cement. Thinking that the moon is a small hole at the top of the sky, the man moth scales a tall building, expecting to push his small head through that round, clean opening. Obviously mistaken in his perceptions and expectations, the reader recognizes the situational irony and is hardly surprised that he fails and falls back to the cracked pavement. So those are my examples of irony. Finally, our last topic is illusion. An illusion is when the writer references specific historical events, current events, religious beliefs or texts, or other literary works. And because he expects the reader to recognize and understand the illusion, it is important for the reader of the poem to consider the writer's intended audience. This is especially true for older poems. The Man Moth, I decided, does not contain any obvious examples of illusion. There is, however, the epigraph of the poem, the one-line statement that appears under the title that reads, "Man Moth, newspaper misprint for Mammoth." This may allude to a real event that some of Bishop's readers might have recognized, and so it's a kind of inside joke, but I don't think it's a really persuasive example of illusion. So I turned to Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, and this is from section 10 of Song of Myself. "The runaway slave came to my house and stopped outside. I heard his motions crackling the twigs of the woodpile. Through the swung half door of the kitchen, I saw him limpsy and weak, and went where he sat on a log, and led him in and assured him, and brought water and filled a tub for his sweated body and bruised feet, and gave him a room that entered from my own, and gave him some coarse, clean clothes. and remember perfectly well his revolving eyes and his awkwardness, and remember putting plasters on the galls of his neck and ankles. He stayed with me a week before he was recuperated and passed north. I had him sit next to me at table. My firelock leaned in the corner. So for an American reader, knowing that this poem was written in 1855, just a few years before the beginning of the Civil War, we recognize this as an allusion to the most pressing and urgent political and humanitarian issue at Whitman's time, the issue of slavery. The reference to the North here, that there was a boundary between the North and the South, alluding to things like the Underground Railroad, for example. And Whitman's readers would certainly have recognized this allusion in 1855 when this poem was first published. So we're done talking about figures of speech. So writing an explication now. As I recommended in part 1 of this presentation, the structure of the poem should guide your writing. Explicate one stanza or a few lines at a time. Summarize them and show how their meaning is enhanced or complicated by specific uses of figurative language. The Man Moth, it's 48 lines. It's too long for a full explication to be practical here, but I will explicate the final stanza to give you an example. I want you to notice once I get it up that my explication is not like just a list of literary devices. Rather, I explain the meaning of the stanza, I summarize it, and I do it in a way that incorporates examples of figurative language as I go along. So here is the last stanza. I'm not going to read it if you'd like to pause just for a reminder. And then we'll continue with my explication. Now, I couldn't do this in proper MLA format because I couldn't get it to fit in a screenshot that would be readable. So the right margin is wrong and the line spacing is wrong. But nevertheless, in the last stanza, Bishop continues her detached examination of the man moth, offering him to the reader as a kind of specimen to be studied. She recommends examining him with a flashlight, particularly his eyeball, the pupil of which she describes metaphorically as an entire night in itself. The comparison of his eye to the night sky is further elaborated in the same line with a surreal metaphor describing the haired horizon of his eyelid. The nocturnal man moth resists investigation, however, shutting his eyes against the bright light. He might even tear up, Bishop says. A tear, she writes, is his only possession, which is paradoxical because it seems impossible to keep in one's possession something so ephemeral as a teardrop. But her word choice implies there is something valuable and precious about it. She uses a simile, comparing it to a bee's sting, suggesting perhaps that in the same way the bee's only defense is to sting, killing itself in the process, the man moth's tear is a reflexive reaction to unwanted scrutiny and attention. He does not want us to see the tear, she continues. Instead, he will palm it or swallow it, maybe because he is a man after all, and men are not supposed to cry or share their pain. But we know how he suffers. We know he dreams of one day escaping the monotony, ugliness, and alienation of the city, even if it ultimately means ending his own existence. In the last 2 lines of the poem, his tear develops into a potent symbol of empathy, of human connection. Bishop describes it in an ironic and poignant simile as pure and cool as spring water. To drink it would fill an aching emptiness inside us. It is a natural antidote to what she suggests is the disease of modern life. That's about 300 some words, pretty lengthy, 3 paragraphs. So if I were to do that, if I were to treat all 6 stanzas the same way, I'd wind up with a 2,000 word essay with somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 20 paragraphs. So what's next? What does one do after one gets the explication to this point? And that is research. And that will be the topic of another presentation. There is Elizabeth Bishop herself. What I'm going to show you here is a list of keywords, vocab that you should know for explicating. You'll notice that under each word, I gave you different forms of that word, like a noun, like for example, personification there in the middle panel. The verb form personify, to personify, an adjective personified. This can help you when you're writing your explication. You may not always use the noun forms of these literary terms. So make sure you spend some time studying these. It will be on the quiz. And that concludes this presentation on explicating poetry.